Well, let's keep the extraordinary rhythm of the conference, or I don't even like the word conference. Let's let the extraordinary rhythm of the gathering continue. Of course, I have the privilege of making yet another introduction of an extraordinary faculty person, and if you have not met nor interacted with Dr. Susan Rowland, you are in certainly for a treat. She is what I would call and describe a one-of-a-kind. James Hillman told me years ago, he said, Steve, you know, Pacifica needs to be filled with people that are really bright, insightful, classically trained, imaginative, and above all, odd. Odd meaning exceptional. Exceptional. Dr. Rowland is just that, exceptional, both as a disciplined scholar and an evolved educator. For her students, she is a professor, a provocateur, a magician, a stage director, a sage, and an advocate. She is wickedly funny with a flair for the creative. Her students come away with a true love of the humanities, a program that she orchestrates, directs here at Pacifica. From the classics to contemporary literature to a wide range of depth psychological works, Susan mentors her students in the craft of critical thinking while all the while cultivating the joy of learning. In fact, it was just recently here, I believe even in this building, that a number of her students picked up aspects of Shakespeare's work and then enacted, embodied, and presented through projects and so on. As word gets out, folks are traveling from faraway places to study the humanities with an emphasis in depth psychology with Dr. Susan Rowland and her colleagues. Before coming to Pacific, Dr. Rowland was a professor of English and Jungian Studies at the University of Greenwich, London. She's author of a number of books, Jungian Literary Theory, Gender and Myth. That'll be great. Someday we'll replace gender with ginger. One day. These include Jung as a writer, Jung, a feminist revision, c.g.jung in the humanities, and the eco-critical psyche, literature, evolutionary complexity, and Jung. Susan was the founding chair of the International Association of Jungian Studies and is currently working on a project called, I love this, How to Save the Red Book from Jung and Jung from the Red Book. Beautiful. Her presentation this morning is titled Trickster, Mythographer, Eco-Poet, c.g.jung's Dramatic and Imaginative Writing of the Living Mysteries. Will you please join me in welcoming a master teacher, an esteemed colleague, and one of our field's shining lights, Dr. Susan Rowland. Susan.
I'm not accustomed to speaking with a mic, so this is beginning as a test. Thank you, Steve, for that introduction I cannot possibly follow. And in particular for the word odd. I'm intending to cultivate the stereotype of the eccentric English woman. And living up to my reputation of being a boring, pedantic teacher, you all have a handout, and you will need it, or at least I request you to have it in your hand, because I will be making use of it. This presentation is about c.g.jung's writing. Not specifically, this time, the Red Book. I am talking about the writing that he had published in his lifetime, the writing that we find today in the collected works. To be specific, I'm going to be talking to research that I published in Jung as a writer and the eco-critical psyche, which you can find at a bookstore near you, very near you today. What's really important is that this is not about reading Jung for what he may have intended when he wrote particular words, phrases, sentences, paragraphs, and books. When we say, what did Jung really mean by this when we are puzzled by something in the collected works, which is something that we all say a lot when we read Jung, and we've been taught to say it, and it feels natural. It feels natural to read an author as esteemed as Jung and say, well, what did he really mean by this? Feels natural. It's not natural. It's a cultural way of reading. And that doesn't make it wrong, but it does mean that it's not the only way reading has been done or could be done. And why I've spent many years challenging this way of reading Jung is that it's not Jungian. Because if we think about it, if we say, what did Jung really mean by this, then we are imagining the author of this writing as a certain kind of God. We make the author into the God of the text, the God who potentially knows everything, who knows everything about what the writing means. And we can have Jung sitting next to us, if he were around, and I have often pointed out to students that actually we can't dig him up and ask him questions. We can have, even if he was in the same room and able to answer questions, and if we said to him, Professor Jung, what did you really mean by this sentence? He'd probably say, I've forgotten. I've changed my mind. I wouldn't write it like that now. Or, it's none of your business. Really, I mean, to put this in depth psychological terms, when we say, what did Jung really mean by this, we are reading for ego. We are reading for the knowable, rational part of the writer's psyche. And I think that you've all come here knowing that the knowable, rational part of a writer's psyche is essential, but not all there is. And I know that many of my distinguished colleagues speaking yesterday were talking about the input of the unknown, of the voices that come to us, of even having a sense of creativity that can't be wholly put into words, but you just do your best as a writer to do so. And as people who care about depth psychology and care about c.g. Jung's work, we know that all the time he's talking about what we don't rationally, in ego terms, know as being really, really important. So to read for author intention is to read for ego. It's not wrong, but it's not Jungian, because it's not allowing the otherness of his writing to come through. I said this was a cultural way of reading, not a natural way of reading. And it's worth noting that this idea of the author as the God of the book, as the owner of the meaning, and I think ownership is part of this, it's part of the last 2 or 3 centuries of capitalism, and it's part of the last 2 or 3 centuries of individualism. Really, before the Romantic period, there weren't really authors. There were writers, but there weren't authors. The idea of the author as the origin, the parent of the meaning, is really a relatively modern idea. And one of the things about Jung that we all know and value is that he has a very strong sense of culture and history and how the psyche has been differently considered in those times. And there is so much of him that is of romanticism, of those ideas of the creative imagination that were in philosophy and art and so many of the practices of the time. There's also a lot of him that goes back further than that found in alchemy a way of working with symbols, and I'm going to come back to the symbol later, a way of working with symbols that was highly exciting and expanding to what he was trying to do. Shakespeare, to give you an example of what I'm talking about, was a writer but not an author. He was not the author of his works. And I don't mean that this in the terms of, somebody else might have written them. He wasn't an author of his plays because he didn't publish them. They weren't his. He didn't feel that he was going to own them for all time. They were work. They were the day job. He wrote the plays. They got performed. They existed in the theatre. They didn't exist in something where he would just own those words, because their real meaning came in the performance, and a performance will change every time. The reason we don't have fixed versions of Shakespeare's plays is that he did not publish them. What happened was people went to the theatre, they thought, this is good, I need to make some money, so they wrote things down in the theatre. And then they took them off to a printer, ran off a few copies, and made some money. So we have these inaccurate versions of Shakespeare because he never published his plays. It was after his death that friends of his thought, we really ought to get these scripts together and do something so that we can keep using them. So although Jung wrote and published in an era of authors, and although reading for author intention is so ingrained in us to be natural, and it produces all sorts of useful things, it certainly in part produces Jungian analysis and depth psychology and all the things we do, it's not, I think, a Jungian way of reading his work. And that means there are other things, there are other opportunities. So that's what I'm going to develop this morning. So I'm saying that whereas Jung is usually considered a writer about the imagination, about myth, about symbolism, about poetics, he is more properly a writer of the imagination, myth, symbolism, poetics, and literature. I'm saying that Jung is a creative writer. He's a writer expressing the whole soul, not writing about the soul from the outside. And, we might want to ask, well, why is he writing in this way that is not expected so much of someone who would at times call himself a scientist? And I think all of us have had the experience of reading Jung and feeling a little bit frustrated, it's a bit hard to kind of follow and trying to kind of work out what the actual concepts are. And many of my colleagues have suggested that this is because Jung is a bad writer. My point is that Jung is a creative writer. He is performing. He is performing his ideas. He's not writing about them from the outside. So that you get many, many voices in the collective works. And that's not because he can't think straight. It's because those voices are true to the psyche, and that's what he wants. I think he wrote not to inform people, he wrote to treat people. I think the collected works are a form of treatment for the whole world, and obviously through that reading experience that he gives us. So I'm beginning to suggest why he's writing as he does. Most of Jung's patients, he says, came to him because nothing in their lives seemed to have meaning. On a bigger scale, in a time directly touched by 2 world wars, Jung believed modern warfare, characterized by barbed wire and poison gas. And that's a quote from Modern Man in Search of a Soul that came out in 1933. Jung believed that this kind of warfare wasn't something separate from psychology. It was itself very much part of this psychological crisis that was a cultural crisis. Jung held that the modern Western world was sick because it had excluded so much that seemed other. So Jung, as a writer, tries to address the long marginalization of this psychic other, summoning into his texts what has haunted modernity as the feminine, the body, nature, myth, and the unconscious. And there are, as you will know, these things have in various times been called the feminine. His works became spaces where the human sciences, the humanities, find a new breath of being. To read Jung is to witness a great quest to heal modernity by rebalancing the founding myths of consciousness. I'm going to give you a very big idea right now, and then I'm going to go and kind of show you how that idea can be sustained, I hope. Because I'm suggesting, and I'm going to base this argument on a remarkable book that many of you will know, and that's The Myth of the Goddess by Anne Baring and Jules Cashford, 2 Jungian analysts. And they look at images of the goddess in Western culture, and they posit that there are 2 types of creation myth that actually structure 2 types of consciousness. And that both these types of consciousness, one associated with the masculine, the other associated with the feminine, they are given to us in culture by 2 types of religious form, and both of them are necessary for psychic wholeness. And the problem with our world, largely, they argue, is that one type of consciousness has been dominant and has worked very hard to try and exclude and certainly marginalize the other type of consciousness. So what they call Earth Mother consciousness is based, may well have come from the Earth Mother goddess that we imagine to predate the main monotheisms. And the Earth Mother, in this sense, is simply the notion that we come from the Earth, that the Earth herself is sacred, and that the Earth gives birth to men and women and everything that is on the planet. And in that sense, consciousness is based not on separation, but on connection. We are conscious because we are connected to the earth. We are conscious because we are embodied on the earth. So body and connection become a basis of consciousness. But really, you need another idea to make us into beings with a conscious and unconscious soul. So the monotheisms embody the other idea. The idea that of a sky father, of a masculine God who creates the earth as separate from himself. And separate from himself, and therefore consciousness is based on separation. And a sky father God instates dualism. Because if you have a God that is separate from matter, then you immediately have a two-ness about things. That two-ness becomes expressed as 2 genders, and unfortunately, two-ness, when it's lived out in culture, tends to produce a hierarchy. The 2 things, one becomes the privileged thing and the other becomes the underprivileged thing. And one of the words that we have for this is patriarchy. A sky father god, a monotheistic god, in my opinion, doesn't have to be a god that regards one gender as superior to the other, but that is certainly how monotheistic Christianity has tended to develop in the last 2,000 years. And that dominance of that particular understanding of that particular religious form has meant there's been an emphasis on separation and an emphasis on consciousness, rationality as essentially masculine, and ultimately the construction of a certain kind of ego. Now, I'm actually getting back here to my first point about ways of reading. Reading for ego, reading for author intention, is a Sky Father monotheistic practice. And let me just explain a little bit more about that. That in asking ourselves, what does Jung really mean by this? We are imagining a being separate from the writing in front of us, who is separate from this text, but who is the source of meaning. And we're imagining a kind of rationality in that being. We are imagining a knowability in that being. So it's not surprising that reading for author intention, Sky Father reading, has become the dominant mode of reading in the last few centuries, because there seems to have been a movement of intensifying monotheistic practices at the same time as the religion as something that was unquestioning in our culture has declined. And I'm not simply knocking Christianity here. Christianity, like any great successful religion, has had strong elements of the goddess in it, as well as strong elements of the Sky Father. And there are many forms of Christianity and many ways in which embodiment in the feminine hasn't always been repressed. But obviously, we can think of examples when it has. If we look at the history of the past 1,000 years in the Western world and the European world, for example, some rather dark practices such as the Inquisition, such as the persecution of witches, can be seen, the persecution of witches, very obviously an attempt to repress elements of the goddess in the culture, but the Inquisition, the attack on heretics, is actually an attempt to repress different ways of reading the Bible. Attempt to repress any deviance from one dominant meaning and who owns that one dominant meaning, the hierarchy dominant at the time. For many centuries, the Catholic Church, but we all know that today there are a number of centres of dominant meaning and a number of ways of punishing people who don't simply read texts the way we're told to read texts. Earth Mother can be a form of reading too, and this, I think, is the Jungian form of reading that I've been trying to encourage in my work and in my teaching. Because just as there is reading for author intention, looking for a oneness of meaning, a Sky Father meaning, so there is a reading for many voices. And this I've come to call animistic reading. The Earth Mother goddess, the idea that the earth is sacred, is very often expressed in religious terms in what I'm going to call animism. The term is much debated at the moment in many fields, including depth psychology, but I use it here simply to mean many voices, many sources of meaning embodied in the earth, and here embodied in the text. The idea that writing can have many different voices, that there isn't a one coherent meaning, that there are many possible ways of reading, and that this is a liberation of the psyche. This is something that has started to emerge in the discipline that I was trained in, literary studies. And it's something that is, I'm arguing, is deeply present in depth psychology. The two have not really come together, and I'm trying to bring the two together in looking at the ways in which literary studies actually promotes the many possible meanings of literature. And for us in depth psychology, we are permitted by the author, Jung, to look for the many, many voices in depth psychology texts. Let me kind of back up what I'm saying now from Jung, from the writings of the collected works themselves. So on the handout, the first quotation, I'll just read you a little bit of it. This is from the beginning of Aeon, or Ion. Starting about a third of the way in. Therefore, in describing the living processes of the psyche, I deliberately and consciously give preference to a dramatic, mythological way of thinking and speaking, because this is not only more expressive, but also more exact than an abstract scientific terminology, which is wont to toy with the notion that its theoretic formulations may one day be resolved into algebraic equations. I think he's saying that maths is not the best way of doing psychology. What I find fascinating here, he's actually talking about his conscious intentions in writing, but his conscious intentions are to liberate the imagination. And I love the two words, more exact. He's saying being imaginative, using poetry, using myth, is more exact than using an abstract concept. Why is it more exact? Well, he says so on quotation 4. We have to break down life and events, which are self-contained processes, into meanings, images, concepts, well knowing that in doing so we are getting further away from the living mystery. As long as we ourselves are caught up in the process of creation, we neither see nor understand. Indeed, we ought not to understand, for nothing is more injurious to immediate experience than cognition. But for the purposes of cognitive understanding, we must detach ourselves from the creative process and look at it from the outside. In this way, we meet the demands of science. Now, another way of putting this is to say we have two creation myths of consciousness, and one of them says we have to step back and we have to look at knowledge. We have to make knowledge by stepping back, and then we'll be able to produce abstract concepts. A concept is by definition transcendent of the material that produced it. This is the way of the transcendent Sky Father. But doing psychology, actually being in the living mystery, that is an Earth Mother way of being, of knowing. We know also through being connected, through being in our bodies, through being in touch with the other. And this is something that I think any therapist knows, that you and I say this not because I have any therapy training at all, but because I've spent a lot of time listening to therapists and analysts, a kind of knowing, coming through the imagination, through the dream, through the body. This is the Earth Mother. So my argument about these creation myths of consciousness and Jung's writing is that all his writing is an attempt to rebalance the psyche. It's an attempt to rebalance the creation myths of Western modernity by emphasizing, embodying, liberating the animistic voices of the Earth Mother and bringing the Earth Mother back into what we're calling depth psychology. I think on another level, he has a bit of a problem with the feminine. So I think there's a certain amount of disguise of the Earth Mother in Jung's work. I think the Earth Mother is very evidently there in synchronicity, where he talks about synchronicity as nature with a capital N, sacred nature, expressing herself in a new way. I particularly think the Earth Mother is there in the trickster, and clearly there in the relationship between Eros and Logos, and his confusion about whether these belong to men or women, or whether they are potentials in both men and women. I think Jung wanted to bring back the feminine for modernity because he knew that that was essential. I think he had a bit of a problem about seeing women as equals. And really, what you see in his work is a drive to bring back the feminine in order to shore up the masculine. He's a conservative with revolutionary ideas. He doesn't really want the social status, the social relationship between men and women to change all that much. He gets irritated with women. That comes out in the writing. But basically, it's the feminine that has to come back. And here I should say, of course, that Earth Mother isn't a woman. Earth Mother has to be, she is prior to both genders. She is capable of, she's clearly giving birth to both genders. There is nothing that says that the Earth Mother is a goddess for women alone. She is very much a goddess for men as well. And of course, she's back in a number of ways. One of the ways she's back is through depth psychology itself. Depth psychology recognizes the Earth Mother, has a slightly different name for her. She's called the pre-Oedipal Mother. But everything you know about the pre-Oedipal Mother is her as the Earth Mother as well. And that's not the only way in which she's come back into our everyday life, as I will go on to say. But I just want to draw your attention to quotation 2. It's not the most exciting set of words in the collected works, but in my view, this is Jung's metaphysical principle. This is the starting point in Jung's ideas, and everything is built upon this statement. Nobody drew the conclusion that if the subject of knowledge, the psyche, were in fact a veiled form of existence not immediately accessible to consciousness, then all our knowledge must be incomplete, and moreover to a degree that we cannot determine. I said this is a metaphysical principle. By that I mean that it's the thing you have to start with, that isn't produced by anything prior to itself. It's the starting point. And the starting point I'm suggesting with Jung's writing is this idea that the existence of the unconscious makes all our knowledge provisional. We cannot be absolute about knowledge because there is a part of us that we do not know about, and we do not know how it is affecting what we know. everything, it seems to me that everything comes from this, so that all those concepts that we know and love, like archetypes and the shadow and the self, these are hypotheses. They are presented as possibilities, as pragmatic ways of working with the psyche. Because after all, they are concepts. They are what you get when you step back from the psyche. They are necessary. We have to have the concepts, but again and again, we're told in the writing that we shouldn't be taking them as absolute, that these have to be taken as something that is both a rational way of being, but also is subject to unraveling. A word that I'm coming to here that I know many of you know is deconstruction. Deconstruction is associated with a philosophy developed in the second half of the 20th century. It's the idea that things both make and unmake themselves. Jung's quote here, "Nobody drew the conclusion," the one I've just read, that is deconstruction. That is saying that we make and unmake our knowledge at the same time, that we cannot regard anything as absolute if we want to take the psyche seriously. In many ways, Jung anticipates deconstruction, and I think that's one of the gifts of his work to us. Because another way of looking at deconstruction is, let's rebalance the creation myths, so that the myth that allows for a knowledge as connected and therefore immanent and therefore grounded and therefore not absolute and up there, that is another thing that comes through deconstruction. Okay. Another way I've characterized this Jung's way of writing is that he is writing as a trickster. He is the writer as trickster. And you might want to bear that in mind if we look at quotation 3, which is one of my favorites. And it brings us back to the feminine. The anima has an erotic emotional character, the animus a rationalizing one. Hence, most of what men say about feminine eroticism, and particularly about the emotional life of women, is derived from their own anima projections and distorted accordingly. On the other hand, the astonishing assumptions and fantasies that women make about men come from the activity of the animus, who produces an inexhaustible supply of illogical arguments and false explanations. This is unbalanced. It's unbalanced in more than one sense. It's 3 sentences. They really do occur in this order. It comes from a piece on marriage. And each sentence comes from a different perspective. The first sentence is a Sky Father sentence. He's telling us about the concepts. It's an ungendered voice. It's a detached voice. The animus is this, so the anima is this, the animus is that. Very reasonable. We can work with that. It's a little oppositional, but we can work with that. The second sentence is gendered because it's written from the point of view of a man. hence most of what men say about feminine eroticism, etc., is derived from their anima projections and distorted accordingly. Well, I think a lot of women would agree with this sentence, and maybe a lot of men would agree with this sentence. It's not too provocative, and it's saying something very interesting, that we are not unbiased and wholly objective when we confront the other gender. Now, the third sentence, who is speaking in the third sentence? Well, if you actually look at those first two sentences, it tells you something about the third sentence. I mean, yes, it's kind of a man, but it's kind of not a man. Who is speaking? It's the anima, yeah. I mean, if you look at that second sentence, we're told it's the anima will distort a man's view of women. And then we get the third sentence, and that's really a distortion. It's really kind of, it loses it. That voice is not the voice of the first sentence. This is the voice of the anima. Now, what I find fascinating is this deliberate or not? You know, is Jung playing a trick, the trickster, playing a trick on his readers, okay? Now, I'm telling you that, you know, men get distorted about women, so, you know, let's show them what it really looks like and see if they spot it. Or has he really lost it? Does he know that the anima has taken over his pen or not? And is that a deliberate strategy to try and teach the reader? We don't know. We have no way of knowing. This is why author intention has a limit. But we, you know, it's irritating, it's hilarious, it's ridiculous, it's wonderful. The trickster writer. He says something, I think, to put this in a cultural context, in quotation 5, one of my favourite quotations about culture. As you can see, it's been highly edited. If you write a book, or if you want to publish a book about Jung's writings, the question of quotations and getting permission for quotations and paying for quotations means a certain amount of editing. But the medieval carnivals were abolished relatively early. Our solution, however, has served to throw the gates of hell wide open. And it's not edited out of context. He really is making a connection between the loss of a culture of carnival and opening the gates of hell. Really, trickster writing is carnival writing. The carnivals, they were part of the Christian culture, but they were also part of the folk culture. They were part of a survival of many pagan practices. They were about fun, they were about dancing, they were about eating and drinking. They were a moment in which those two creation myths could live more harmoniously together. The carnivals were largely banished by Protestant Reformation, and clearly very important in ushering in the kind of world that Jung felt had become sick because of the exclusion of all these pagan practices that would allow the life of the body, the life of the feminine to have more expression. Okay. The trickster is, of course, something that Jung expresses in the writing in terms of the trickster myth and the trickster image. Quotation 9 over the page. This, I think, is the Earth Mother in trickster form in Jung's work. Jung prefers to talk about the trickster in masculine language. But the trickster isn't a man, isn't necessarily of masculine gender. The trickster is the possibility of both genders. That's part of the trickiness of the trickster. So he says here, this is one of the few places where he addresses the trickster in its incarnation as Earth Mother, as pre-Oedipal mother. Even the trickster's sex is optional despite its phallic qualities. He can turn himself into a woman and bear children. This is a reference to his original nature as a creator, for the world is made from the body of a god. And this is very much the Earth Mother myth, making the world from the body, which is, of course, not how Genesis is traditionally interpreted, although you can see in Genesis traces of the Earth Mother. If you recall, in Genesis there are two accounts of the creation of human beings. One is the famous one where God makes Adam and then, decides that another one might be useful and makes the woman from the rib. The other one does not differentiate in any way between men and women in terms of their closeness to God, and simply talks about God taking the dust, the earth, and making men male and female. Very much more in terms of the Earth Mother myth. Now, I've said there are a number of ways in which the Earth Mother is returning to us, and depth psychology's pre-Oedipal mother is one of them. Obviously, I'm also saying that Jung's notion of the embodied unconscious is an incarnation of Earth Mother. Another way that is of relevance here is that Earth Mother returns to us in the theory of evolution. Evolution, beginning with the work of Darwin, is the idea that the Earth produces everything, that all life comes from the planet. It's the Earth Mother without the sacred. And it's quite interesting to read about Darwin's difficulties in attempting to write the early books of evolution. He was writing very much, of course, against the prevailing culture and the idea that some outside agency had been responsible for at least helping to generate life on Earth. So he had an agency problem. How could he write about evolution without bringing in some kind of God? And his solution was deceptively obvious, and that is he talks about Mother Nature. So that in his actual works on evolution, The Origin of the Species, for example, you get he talks about nature. He uses the myth of the Earth Mother in order to talk about nature being the drive behind the evolution of species. And of course, that was a kind of huge cultural shock to the religious culture of the time. But gradually, evolution has become very ingrained in how we see the world. But evolution itself is now a complex set of theories. And a recent development in evolutionary theory, known as complexity theory, or sometimes known as emergence, is something that has become very interesting to depth psychology. Jung himself writes about evolution, writes about the way in which he sees archetypes as part of an evolutionary pattern. So it's not surprising that in the new development of complexity theory, many depth psychology scholars, for example, Helene Schulman, Jerome Bernstein, Joseph Cambray, to name just a few, have been interested in this question of how the psyche is part of an evolutionary web. So I'm just going to say something about complexity theory, and then I'm going to say something about the psyche, and then I'm going to say something about symbols and writing. And there will be plenty of time for discussion. My aim is to finish 15 minutes at most. Complexity theory challenges what we generally take from Darwin as the basis of evolution is about competing species. Complexity theory says no, it's not about competing species. What it seems to be about is about very complex environments encountering each other, and that encounter being so complex that it is impossible to map these complex interactions. That's why it's complex. And these complex environments are known as complex adaptive systems because they're changing through their complexity. And so complex is it that what's coming out of that complexity doesn't seem in any rational way to kind of add up. Literally, it doesn't add up in terms of you have one, you have another, and so we know what's going to come out of it. We don't know what's going to come out of it. And what that means is that we need to use words like intelligence, creativity, even animation of nature. Models of nature in the last few hundred years have been rather dominated by notions of the mechanical. That scientists have tended to think of nature as rather machine-like. But this is absolutely what is being taken apart by complexity theory. Complexity theory, it says that we're beginning to see that actually nature is incredibly creative, and that arguably the creativity of human beings is part of the creativity of nature. That our creativity isn't just us being human and separate from the world and different from the world, that actually nature is incredibly creative in these complex adaptive systems, in its complexity evolution, because things emerge, hence emergence. Things emerge that cannot be predicted by our more mechanical scientific models. So we are, in this sense, an aspect of nature's creativity. Our creativity is nature's creativity. Culture is the creativity of nature. I think here you can see that this complexity evolution is, again, very much bringing us back to an Earth Mother idea of we are who we are because of our connection, because of our embodiment. Complexity theory sees us as made up of complex adaptive systems. The human body and psyche is a complex adaptive system, but it's one that is not separate from the complex adaptive systems of our environment. We're so used to thinking of ourselves as separate from the world. Again, it's one of these things that appears natural, but is in fact, of course, intensely cultural. But, of course, you know, without oxygen, without gravity, without food, we'd be dead. So we know that we're not separate from the world. So it's not surprising that we may be complexly engaged with the world through our unconscious psyche or that we're calling the unconscious psyche, which isn't really just a disembodied thing, but is very much engaged with the matter of our bodies and the matter of our environment. Well, I seem to have gone quite away from Jung's writing here, but I haven't really. I want to draw your attention to the quotation 6, the one that goes over the page. And he's talking about psychic knowledge. How do you have knowledge of the psyche and the language that you use for it? The moment one forms an idea of a thing and successfully captures one of its aspects, one invariably succumbs to the illusion of having caught the whole. One has taken possession of it, and I think the note on ownership of meaning is really, really important. And it has become an inalienable piece of property, like a slain creature of the wild that can no longer run away. It is a magical procedure, such as the primitive practices upon objects and the psychologist upon the psyche. He never suspects that the very fact of grasping the object conceptually gives it a golden opportunity to display all those qualities which would never have made their appearance had it not been imprisoned in a concept. There's a lot here, and some of it is very like quantum theory, because he's saying that if you use concepts, you get what concepts give you, and that may not be all that's there. That the language we use will affect what we find. If you measure it for waves, you get waves. If you measure it for particles, you get particles. Conceptual language changes how we receive the psyche. But he also says, that this idea of possessing meaning is like a slain creature of the wild. And I always get this idea at this point, this image from this writing of the big game hunter. I mean, this kind of thing, this writing was done in the 30s. This idea of the hunter. You want to learn about animals, so you go and shoot them. And that was a model of gaining knowledge about animals, which has been somewhat discredited. And I also love that it says here, it's a magical procedure like the primitive, like the psychologist. Now, primitive is a condescending word for tribal peoples, and there's that to be critiqued in Jung. But he's actually saying the tribal person, the shaman, and the psychologist, they're not that different. They're both doing magic, because actually what they're doing isn't as rational as the psychologist thinks he's doing. It's both there is a magic in conceptual language, and it might be a good magic, it might do good things, but that doesn't mean that it's to be taken as the only way of working with this material. So language isn't neutral. Language isn't a window on reality. The language that we use, the language that we work with, contains assumptions that we may not be conscious of. Most of the time, we aren't conscious of the assumptions built into the language that we're born into. But it will affect, deeply affect, I'm not saying determine, but deeply affect what it is that we're getting as knowledge. Language is not a neutral, transparent screen upon which reality kind of is just there beyond it. Language actually transforms what we take to be real. Very very interesting book on this, and it's so interesting that I put it as quote 13. Book called The Cosmic Web. It's mainly about literature, but the first chapter is really interesting because it outlines this idea that language isn't a window. Language is like a sticky web that connects us to the world. And she tells of an interesting experiment that was done at the beginning of the 20th century. And she doesn't give many details, but so I invite people to look it up in the book. But basically, a group of scientists got together and said, let's make a language, a perfect language for our experiments. You know, let's get rid of all these metaphors. You know, let's find a clean, perfect, clinical language. And we still have this fantasy about a clinical language. And they worked, and they worked, and they worked, and then they gave up. They couldn't do it. They could not find a language for scientific experiments that would not pre-structure, affect the results of those experiments. And I think that's when experimental science comes into the humanities, because the humanities are always working with the sense that language affects the knowledge that they're trying to build. So, just to kind of end this, it's really all about symbols. Jung makes a distinction between symbols and signs, and I'm sure everybody knows this. He's particularly talking about working with dream images, but in an essay on poetry, he says that we can take images in two ways. An image could be a sign pointing to a known thing. An image could be basically about the ego, about the knowable, about the rational. And we often use language like that. But there are images that Jung called symbols, and these are images that are saturated with the collective unconscious. These are images that point to the unknown, the not yet knowable, that point towards a possible meaning. They don't claim to know and to offer that meaning as a knowable thing that you immediately grasp. And dream images can be considered as signs or symbols. Well, of course, this is one of Jung's famous oppositions, and as we know about these famous oppositions, they tend to deconstruct. They're not stable. And Jung then maps these oppositions onto his ideas about literature and art. That we can think of literature and art as being mainly about signs, about known things, or we can think of literature and art as being full of symbols. And his word for that was visionary, where the artist, and this is something I think Dennis was talking about yesterday, where the artist is not in control of the meaning, where the voices come to you, where you are inspired. That is the visionary artist in Jung's conceptual language, and visionary art is what is produced to just do away with. But we can read for symbols. We can read for the unconscious. Not only is Jung a writer, a trickster writer, liberating many voices in his writings, but we can see in the writing the opportunity to choose to read that way, to read for Earth Mother embodiment and for the acknowledging of the riches of the unconscious as infinitely precious and infinitely important to who we are, but also very much what needs to be more part of the culture we live in. So, to end this, What I'm arguing about the symbol is that art, literature, where we find symbols, we find nature. Remember complexity evolution. We are co-evolving with the complex adaptive systems of nature. The symbol, which is really another word for archetypal image, the symbol is an embodied psychic thing. But in this understanding of our embodied psyche in complexity evolution, it is an embodied psychic thing that is not just us, it is us in the world. It is nature talking to us. I'm arguing that the symbol in art is not just an image, it's a portal, it's a door to nature. It is nature speaking to us just as we are speaking to nature. That when we experience the symbol, either as writers, artists, readers, witnesses of the symbol, that we are co-evolving, that the symbol is part of our co-evolving complexity evolution with non-human nature. The symbol knits us into the cosmos. And I'm arguing that Jung, as a writer, that's what the writing is doing, that it's knitting us into the cosmos by liberating the many voices in our psyche. Not all of them are human, and all of them are about us being at home in the world. And I'm just going to end by reading a quote that you do not have, but you really do have to hear, from the collected works, if I've got it with me. That one, not that one. Okay, it's got to be here. Yeah. Okay. So while I'm doing that, while I'm finding my quotation, you probably want to think, yeah. Think of a question or a comment. Here it is. This is from Psychology and Alchemy. I came across a last outcropping of this medieval view of the world in my youth in the form of the following tale. This is a Carnival bit. We had at that time a cook from the Swabian part of the Black Forest on whom fell the duty of executing the victims from the poultry yard destined for the kitchen. We kept bantams, and bantam cocks are renowned for their singular quarrelsomeness and malice. One of these exceeded all others in savagery, and my mother commissioned the cook to dispatch the malefactor for the Sunday roast. I happened to come in just as she was bringing back the decapitated cock, and saying to my mother, "He died like a Christian, although he was so wicked. He cried out, 'Forgive me, forgive me,' before I cut off his head. So now he'll go to heaven." My mother answered indignantly, "What nonsense! Only human beings go to heaven." The cook retorted in astonishment, "But of course there's a chicken heaven for chickens, just as there's a human heaven for humans." "But only people have an immortal soul and a religion," said my mother, equally astonished. "No, that's not so," replied the cook. "Animals have souls too, and they all have their special heaven. Dogs, cats, and horses, because when the Saviour of men came down to earth, the chicken saviour also came down to the chickens. And that's why they must repent of their sins before they die, if they want to go to heaven." There's two feminine voices there. There's Jung's mother being the voice of the Sky Father, and there's the cook being the voice of the Earth Mother, and it's really kind of nice. And these things in Jung's writing, I'm saying they're not, trivial. They are where it's at. And there I will finish. Thank you very much for listening. And we certainly have time for questions and comments. And please do use the microphones.
Thank you for your beautiful articulation. I just wanted to point out two things about what you said about language and the complexity of language. That in the Zohar, in the Jewish mystical tradition, there's that same idea of the many voices that were within the text. And the Zohar says that there are actually two creation stories, Bereshit, two beginnings. The first was a primordial creation where the earth voice was heard clearly throughout the creation. And then when words were entered into the world, then the manifest meanings need to get unpacked. And sometimes they are found between the letters rather than the letters themselves. Secondly, interestingly, Freud also pointed out from a rational point of view, when he looked at creative writers, that the unconscious is very dominant in the audience, in the listener, in the writer himself or herself. So, ironically, he was very conscious of the unconscious, but used it from a masculine point of view and didn't completely comprehend it, as Jung did from the Earth Mother point of view in psychology and literature, when he speaks about the voice capturing the artist beyond the artist. So.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yes. I mean, I think it's not surprising that religions have this knowledge of the psyche. We use psychological language, there's religious language, and it's addressing that kind of fundamental reality. Thank you.
The mystics in all religions captured this.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. Your statement that if you want to know about an animal, you shoot one, reminded me of this incident. Nature lovers all got together, and somebody asked a rhetorical question. Has anyone done anything for nature? This man raises his hand and insists that he wants to talk. They say, okay, what did you do? He says, yesterday I shot a woodpecker.
Thank you.
And I want to, I also have a statement. My reading, thanks to you, will never be the same. Not only intention, but voices. And when I hear voices, if I end up getting committed, I'll send you a card from asylum.
Thank you.
For all those voices that you pointed out. But I have a question also. The divinity from Jungian viewpoint, was it masculine or feminine or both?
Well, I think part of Jung wanted it to be masculine, but he knew it was both. Yes.
I wanted to thank you for redeeming deconstructionism for me as a fully recovered academic who spent my 10,000 hours in the consulting room. But I am struck by the image, the story you gave us at the end, because to me there's three voices. There's Jung, the reader of his environment. Jung doing in that little story reporting what you're saying, what I hear you saying is that we need to cultivate the imaginal reader. And as having been one, that's why I read so slow. I'm always going off. But how do we do that culturally? I've got a 10-year-old grandson who's being narrowed daily into the sky god world, and I escaped, but how do we do that as a culture? Cultivate what you're talking about, that we do as therapists, that is moving into the culture, but how do you have any ideas about cultivating the imaginal reader?
Well, I don't think I have any ideas that haven't been stated many times before by those of us educated in the humanities, that the arts are a repository of this kind of exploration of the multiple possibilities of the psyche. And they are a repository that have been culturally marginalized. And this the separation between the sciences and the arts and the sciences and the humanities, you know, it seems that it's gone far enough. It's gone too far if we're now in a position where in the wider education system, in the education of children, you know, the arts are seen as a kind of optional extra for rich kids and not something that is actually kind of central to developing the psyche. So more and more, I think we're getting to the point in different academic disciplines where we're no longer talking about separate disciplines anymore. That the necessity to connect up is becoming more and more urgent. And in a way, climate change is one example of this, that, you know, the scientists say a lot of stuff, but that's not actually addressing what needs to be done. It's not actually doing the reality. To do the reality of where we are with things like climate change, we need all of the ways of knowing and being. So I think that's all I can say at this point. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for a deeply moving talk. And when I heard you speaking, I come from family medicine, and every time when you were talking about symbol and sign, I kept thinking symptom and sign in medicine. And the idea of how we release, you know, the animistic voices of the patient's body. How do we bring that into healthcare reform? Because I think what you're saying is really critical to retrieving at least American medicine from the direction we've been going, where technology is the God, is the sky father. And I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, of course, as you can tell from my accent, I'm not from round here. In England, where healthcare is not as expensive, it's not rationed by your income, and everybody has a family doctor. I've been hearing really interesting stories from people here in this country who've had long-term medical problems, and there was a certain amount, things weren't working in the normal way of doing things until they actually had a long talk with their doctor, and the doctor was able to listen to the whole situation of the patient, and actually had some space in order to think differently. So said, oh, you know, instead of just taking another prescription of pills, why don't you try? I think we have a culture that doesn't allow doctors to have imagination. And that seems to me to be kind of where this is coming from, that the need to operate from the whole self, the whole psyche, in whatever we do in order to really address what's going on in front of us.
Thank you so much. It's not so much a question, but comments, and just to bring forth what was happening to me. I'm not a student at Pacifica. I love Pacifica, and I come to many of the intensives, and I know your faces, and I so love so many of you. When your presentation started, my heart was starting to beat very loudly. And I come from a background of storytellers and healers. And before coming this weekend, I told a friend of mine who lives in Montana in Fort Belknap. She went to Harvard. She's a PhD. She's an incredible storyteller. And she's an elder in her community and does many, many things. And I like what you were saying. For us indigenous people, the mother was never under. For us is what has kept us alive in spite of the fact of relocation with the intention of extermination. And what you're saying, I've come and never have had the courage to stand up and share because it's separatism.
Yes.
And I love the idea that, there's a scholar in the native world, some of you may have heard, Vine Deloria.
Yes.
And he wrote a book about conversations with you. I can't remember. I have the book. I haven't read it yet.
He wrote a book which was published recently called c.g.jung and the Sioux Traditions.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm reading right now Vine Deloria, The Way We Used to Live. I was reading it, some of it last night because something in here was happening that was taking me to him. And this morning, your presentation, I think it's just wonderful to hear because for us, the mother was never under.
Yeah.
And the mother was is the healer. We have ceremonies that we go in that the journey wherever we come from, when we go to, I have lived in different reservations and worked there as a family therapist. And usually the elders just kind of watch me. Then the elders come and say, but do you know how to dance? Do you know how to sing? And so this is very important because if we are ever to get to where Joseph Campbell is talking about, that it's not going to be about this people, that people. There's going to be no separatism in order for us to save the earth.
Yes.
Globally, and we were talking, a friend of mine who came, we were talking about that this morning. Anyway, I love the fact that this is in dialogue, and I want to be your student someday, perhaps. Thank you so much.
At events, I like the word event rather than conference because event we don't know what this is about yet, but clearly things are happening that are not on the schedule, which are perhaps the important things. And coming out of this work, there is a sense in which I think many of us feel that it's the indigenous peoples who may be the saviors of the culture, because they have what the West has persecuted in its own body and needs to reconnect with. Yes.
About writing and reviews, because we live in a culture, I write fiction, we live in a culture where you publish something, it goes off into the world, and reviews have become democratized through Amazon and Goodreads, and the reader has the ability to post a review online, etc. And these are different voices that are being added to the text.
Yeah.
And what do you think about that?
I think it's a frightening world for people publishing. We see this in Jung's collected works even. If you allow many voices in, not all of them are going to be kind. And, it's the many voices, I think we are, maybe the web is part of the solution in the sense of the democratizing of all sorts of things, including power. And maybe it's magic in a good way, but also we know that the potential of people to be hurt, to go crazy, because of the kinds of experiments with their identities that are possible on the web, that the web can be used for spreading violence and violence ideas. So maybe we should be thinking of the internet as a global psyche, and it's got potential for all sorts of good evolution and connecting, as we were saying, but it's also got a shadow and a potential for the shadow to get out of control.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for so much of what you said. I too will never read the same. And the one thing you were talking about, I just wondered if you could say a little more, because I was deeply struck by the idea of the symbol being a doorway to nature, and that nature's talking to us and we're talking to nature and we're co-evolving through that awareness. That was just a very profound thing. As much as I've read about symbol and sign and I even teach about it, that I just wanted to hear more about that, if you could.
Yes, I mean, it's where it's the matter that I'm trying to work with in the eco-critical psyche, and I look at various examples of symbol in literature, from poetry of a great poet like Seamus Heaney, won the Nobel Prize, Jane Austen, not generally thought of as a very symbolic writer, but actually there are deep myths in Jane Austen which are, I think, not sufficiently explored. And Shakespeare, on the idea of how performing is to embody the symbol in a way that in his time the language used of it was magic. That if there is something in this idea that psychically we are in touch with non-human nature, that nature touches us, that nature has an incredible creativity of which we are expressing part of, then the symbol is that connecting stuff. It is matter and psyche, matter and spirit, and it is that way in which the creativity of nature touches our psyche through symbols. So that's what I've been exploring in that idea. Thank you. Yes.
First, I want to say that I'm so sorry you came to the Myth program after I left, because I would have loved to work with you. And for one thing, you've clarified for me why I struggled so much with Marie-Louise von Franz, because I now realize that all the areas where I struggle with her, she is reporting Jung's anima-possessed statements as equal to the rest of his wisdom, and as an acolyte of his, perpetuating them. So I was thinking about this and thinking about, I think I just went into this whole complexity thing right then and there, because I was thinking, wow, you know, how did we perpetuate ideas that were not really ideas, but they were, I just got into how she, through her adoration of him, has been arguing for things that he said in the grip of a complex himself. And I just wondered if you would want to maybe comment about that danger that we have when we worship these amazing people, that we have big banners up here and maybe need to be a little more careful.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of see the animistic reading and the reading for intention, making the author into a kind of god, and clearly one can make an author into a kind of god in more than one way. We need to see them as interconnected. So we see the many voices in a dialogue with the possibility of one voice. And if we don't have to read for author intention, then we don't have to have this idea of betraying an author by reading it in different ways and saying, you know, there were aspects to Jung's personality that we don't need to take too seriously. Yes, we do need to finish. Just very quickly, Juliet.
All I was going to say is thank you, Susan. I'm a student in the Humanities program, and I want to thank you for allowing us all to engage our creative imagination.
Thank you, Juliet. That's a lovely gift from you to me. Over to the lady of the hour.